Okay. I am here today with Daniel Garner from O.G. Rose. It's such a pleasure to have him on. I don't know how many months it's been since I've posted a video, but been busy with a lot of things. But I'm just super honored to be talking to Daniel today, and I got to know Daniel through the work of Guy Sangstock through circling, which a lot of you will be familiar with. A lot of you I know who are watching are also fellow circular practitioners and participants. And right now I'm taking one of Daniel and his wife Michelle's classes on the second part of a book that they wrote called Belonging Again, which is really concerned with how we can form communities that afford proper belonging and becoming, which is something that I want to talk about with Daniel today. And yeah, just introduce yourself briefly, in however whatever fashion you'd feel is appropriate, and then yeah, we can jump right in.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's been wonderful to have you in the class. Oh, Michelle and I love everything you bring, and it's really a treat to have a chance to speak with you. So thank you for the invitation. Michelle and I, we write under O.G. Rose, Opperman Garner Rose, back from 2011, and we've been writing ever since. And Belonging Again is indeed, we released part one, the explanation, trying to kind of discuss the situation when it comes to politics, community, psychology, how people think, subjectivity, that is hindering people to feel belonging, and why there are distinctions between external motivation, intrinsic motivation, extrinsic sources of values and internal sources of value, meaning and belonging, why economics matters, why increasing freedom does not necessarily increase belonging. All of these, dare I say, paradoxical tensions that by not thinking, we find ourselves in a place where we didn't know we would end up. So a kind of a key distinction based on the work of Philip Rieff, who wrote The Triumph of the Therapeutic, is between givens and releases. And what Philip Rieff warned is that the 20th century was increasingly assuming that simply removing givens or constraints, as he called them, we actually call it givens because we think it works more like something you never question. But I don't think Reef would disagree with that. But anyway, the idea was that if you free people from, say, their assumed background, say they're born into Christianity, and you free them from those dogmas, if they are born assuming certain things about the world and you free them, that actually makes them happier in different things. What Philip Reeve warned, as did other peoples like Eric Fromm, and other psychoanalysis, you could say Freud, he was a great Freud scholar with civilizations and discontents, is that human beings actually require some sort of dialectic between givens and releases. If you give them complete freedom, they have no standard by which to decide how they should use their freedom. And then also they tend to become existentially overwhelmed by possibility. Furthermore, if they do make a choice, it's very unlikely their neighbor makes the same choice. And so every time they interact with their neighbor, they can feel like they have to explain themselves, or they can feel awkward or kind of weird. And that can create various tensions where gradually people just get so tired of interacting and having to explain themselves the entire time that they just stop going out, and communities kind of break down. We talk about, there's the famous Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, all of these communal, economic, psychoanalytical. You can talk about Dave over at Theory Underground talks about the loss of time energy. There are all these shifts that have occurred that have made it very, very difficult for community to form, and then for people to also not feel existentially overwhelmed all the time. Now, of course, if you have pure givens and no releases, that's called totalitarianism. That's called the banality of evil of Hannah Arendt, right? But if you have pure release and no standards or structures by which people can make decisions, they become existentially overwhelmed and actually become vulnerable to totalitarianism and popularism and all these strongmen and different things, which has happened today. Well, this is a problem then, because that means some sort of dialectic, some sort of, dare I say, balance between givens and releases have to be struck. And who chooses the givens who isn't asserting power over other people? But if you choose your own givens, aren't they not given? Aren't they arbitrary? Aren't they just preferences? So they lack authority over you. So there's this real paradoxical tension in operation right now that we have to think structurally, politically, economically, et cetera, so forth, in order to address this problem that has been framed. And that's why, part one is called the explanation, kind of explaining all these thinkers like Peter Berger, Philip Reef, et cetera, so forth. In the address is how we would address this very paradoxical situation. Now, just because it's a paradox, though, does not necessarily mean it's doom or something like that. And Hegel, with the language of contradiction, not a logical contradiction, but a tension, that's precisely the opportunity for history to unfold in a new way. It's like the blooming of a seed. Like where you see a paradox, a contradiction, that's where you have a seed that is trying to grow into something. And it's precisely that tension that is that opportunity. So this weird situation we're in, based on how we respond to it, could be the opportunity of a new garden, if you will, or it could be a result of a psychological breakdown that leads to geopolitical tensions of a vast magnitude. So those are a lot, just kind of an overview of the Belonging
Yep.
Again project.
Yep.
And I also love Guy Senstock and
Great.
adore him. So I'm so glad that you saw. He's
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah. He's adored by many. A beautiful man. Okay. Yeah. So there's so much I want to pick up on there. I think the idea of paradoxes being something that the vast majority of people see as a indication of something um, something terribly wrong is just ubiquitous. We see paradoxes as unsolvable contradictions, as if if someone is like, we say, like you're like a walking paradox. You're warm one day, you're cold the next day. You have this political opinion one day, you have, you change your mind the other day, and it's a derogatory association. It's like, it means someone's hypocritical, or they're confused, or they're like not grounded, not like like a lack of clarity, I think. And if you go back to like Heraclitus, he'd talk about, the tension of the bow, right? The tension of the bow, and the bow and arrow, and as you pull the bow back, there's all this tension, and then it gets released, and it's like this, and he talks about the lyre as well, like the music and harmony is like the resolution of tension, between different notes. And then you go to like Nicholas of Cusa, and he's talking about like the coincidentia oppositorum, which is like, the coincidence of opposites, the unity of opposites idea. And then someone like a William Blake, like, centuries later, just dripping with paradox in his poems. And I'm myself an aspiring psychotherapist, and my therapist has his brother is also a therapist, and he started this podcast about a year and a half ago called The Change Paradox. And it's
Mm.
the paradox of change, of like, specifically in a psychotherapeutic context, that um you know to be able to change, you have to accept where you are. And so much of destruction, that leads people to therapy, and I think a lot of bad therapy lies in the lack of acceptance of where somebody is, and meeting them where they are before they can afford the possibility of change. And so,
Mm.
I wanted to tie it back to, to what you were saying about the givens and releases, because I think there's a real tension that I notice, I think especially in like young adulthood, um, with people of my peer group, where they realize that the kind of absolute freedom and liberty of like, high school and college years, um, is not working anymore. Like there's something about the just partying every weekend, smoking and drinking, and kind of not having like an aspirational frame for your life. is problematic, but then it's like the culture doesn't provide you with a clear set of givens. And so people in their 20s like explore a lot of things. They maybe explore religiosity or spirituality or lots of different jobs, lots of different friend groups, hobbies, things like that to try and give them that sense of um of an aspirational vision. And I'm reading right now Aspiration by Agnes Callard. John Vervaeke has mentioned Agnes Callard a lot, and so I picked up that book, and it's really interesting. And I can save some of what I'm thinking about for further down. So, but I'm curious how, because you wrote something in Belonging Again too that I highlighted, which is like we have to learn how to basically be our own authority. Like I'm paraphrasing exactly what you said, but like we basically have to learn how to like impose our own givens, I think is kind of what you're alluding to ourselves. But then you said like if givens are just autodidactic, then how do we know if we're not deceiving ourselves? Because we can give ourselves the given of like um, something bad for us,
Yeah.
and we can believe that it's good. So how I guess how do you and Michelle think about um, how to how to impose like the right givens, givens that actually afford real purpose, meaning, connection, um, becoming, evolution. And do you believe that that's something that can be done in that autodidactic form? Because to me, it seems like there really has to be a community around um, for that to really be afforded.
Excellent. You said a lot there that was outstanding. I think also on this notion of paradox that's so critical is that Hegel pointed out that if I ask you what is a tree, to use an example from Mr. Coates' book, you start having to talk about limbs, branches, veins, waters. You have to pass over into otherness. And so Hegel writes A equals B, because you can't even describe a tree without describing something else. And that actually contradiction is a description of how everything is. So the choice between contradiction and non-contradiction, in a sense, is a false choice because everything is already passing over into otherness. And by contradiction, he doesn't mean a logical contradiction. He means in that German sort of tension sense. Like if I ask you what is a tree, you can't just tell me what a tree is without pointing away from that signifier, right? And the issue is the truth is that basically everything is like that. But if you're trained to believe that things are stable definitions as opposed to unfolding relations or creative processes in a Whitehead, a Bergson, or Vervaeke's work, well, then you actually are going to deny the very movement of your thought that you require to understand the world. And that could set you up for all sorts of mental illness or anxieties or different problems, right? So one of the reasons why it's really important to understand this, world where relation ultimately and time are fundamental and ontological more than space or thingness is because also that's going to have a big impact on our own ability to be in the world and to function well. There was a wonderful thinker named Alfred Korbowski, I believe. He wrote a book called Science and Sanity, and he makes an argument that people's ability to be sane is strongly tied to having the right symbolic framework by which to understand the world. And he makes a point, which I always liked, where he said, if you were using Roman numerals, there are forms of modern mathematics you simply could not do because of the symbolic. It wouldn't matter how smart you were. It wouldn't matter how capable you were. Roman numerals will not allow you to do certain mathematics. And in fact, if you tried, you might go crazy, right? Because the symbolic doesn't match. The same applies to worldviews and philosophies. If you live in a world where things are passed over into otherness, or things are in fact unfolding relations and processes, but the symbolic is one of things and algebra, to allude to the Leibniz-Descartes debate, or solids, or A equals A, well, then there's a mismatch there that is just begging to cause bad mental health for Mr. Kurbowski, a loss of sanity. That's going to lead to all sorts of issues. But you see, this is what's interesting then. If understanding, and this is kind of Hegel's point, if understanding eventually must realize that to be possible, it passes over into otherness, A is B, tree to limb to branches. That's when understanding becomes reason for Hegel. And you must stay in reason to actually have subjectivity function, for you as the human being to function. Well, that's interesting because there's a circling then, there's a movement necessary. And basically, we're in the age where learning and thought require a movement in the form. Like right now, to use a Neil Postman example, we tend to go to school and the association of learning is a trivia game. There's a teacher at the front. They know the answer. Who can answer it first? You go back and forth. So the background of that is not that thought is movement, but that thought is stagnant and you just need to know it or not. There's no development of thought. Somebody already has the answers and you've memorized them or you have not memorized them. In that world, thinking is formulated in a manner that puts it in contradiction with the world that it is thinking about, which will lead for Kurbowski to a loss of sanity, ultimately. And psychosis, if we follow geopolitical tensions, all these psychosis we see around the world, you could see what happens to a globe that are dealing with realities of interconnectivity, pluralism, global connection, but it's stuck in a symbolic of a world that is not connected, that is not unfolding, that is not growing complexity. And that leads to all sorts of various pathologies. So the issue is the given today that would be required would be the givenness of movement, the givenment of something that's moving and that's a process. And why that's an important for the background is because if you choose that, then it's always something ahead of you. Like it's always something moving beyond you. And as a result, you can't render it arbitrary. All you can do is render a moment of it arbitrary. But then, of course, the river keeps going. You mentioned Heraclitus, right? You step in the river, it's never the same river twice. I know Bard has once said it's never the same foot twice either. Well, that means, as the river moves, the givenness, what you're making given is a movement that is always in excess of your scope. So there's something lacking in you. We've been talking in the course, like Jockin has talked about beauty, lack, and all these different things. What has to happen now, and I'll give it back to you and we can expand on this or anything. What happens to, in the past, Givens was based on something stagnant and whole, like let's say the Christian worldview. Okay, what's given is Christianity. Here's the Apostles' Creeds. You follow those. What's given is this stagnant thing. And the mysticism was very much in the background. There was this idea that God would always exceed your ideas of him, but that idea that God exceeded your ideas of him was more background. It wasn't really foreground. It was there, but it was more for your St. Teresa's and maybe St. John's and so on and so forth. We're entering in an age where the mystic is coming more into the foreground, where the thing that has to be given is, in fact, this unknown, that the more you learn of it, the more there's still left to know. And so the thing that is given is always beyond you, and all you can do is gift yourself to the process. I've spoken to Cadell about. So to put it this way, what we have to do is develop practices of making the thing that is our given something that is always in excess of us. But that in of itself requires a certain work of the subject to handle that anxiety, to handle that strangeness, to handle that process. And so the practices we have to engage in are the ones that would make us so able to handle that process, that circling, that mysticism, that apathetic, that dialogos. Vervaeke talks about the dialogos having this timeless character where ideas are coming out of nowhere. Who's knows going to say? That all requires a certain training. And there's something given in the dialogos, that very unfolding, but you cannot capture the flow. You cannot capture that and make it into a worldview. It becomes a way to view the world versus a worldview. So we have to move in that direction, because then that apathetic space has a certain authority over people. So it's not arbitrary, but it's not also something that somebody can claim and hold over other people, because it only emerges in the relation. Well, if it only emerges in the relation, in the community, well, then no single individual can capture it for their own ends. They require that practice of relation. But let me give it back to you.
Yeah, that's all really great. Um, One thing that was coming up for me as you were saying all of that is that, you know, if your kind of ontological grounding is this framework or this capacity um, to essentially always be aspiring, because what you're orienting to is the beyond, right? If you kind of were to map on like Christian mysticism towards it, it's like it's the tension between, Vervaeke talks about this, the finite transcendence, and the exact tension that Jesus had during his life as a human, but also as part of the tripartite God. And so, as a Christian, if you're aspiring to be more like Jesus, you are um, like precisely positioning yourself in that dialectic between, your humanness and all of your faults and your fallibilities, but also your godliness that exists in all of us. Um, but it occurs to me that there's and I think there's a real beauty of that, but there's also a tragedy in that, because it means that you are always um I don't want to say it this bluntly because it feels a little bit harsh, but like you're always not enough in a way,
Hmm.
right? Like there's always so much more that you can be. Like Jordan Peterson talks about this, like you can be so much more than you are right now. And there's a danger, especially in kind of the psychotherapeutic world, to, I think, take, what I was talking about earlier, meeting people where they are, and kind of take that to mean that what you are is all you will ever be, instead of appreciation for what you are right now, but that that can afford real growth and transcendence. Like that's the real psychotherapeutic project, is evolution and becoming. Um, and so I I wonder how, because you mentioned too about beauty, and that there's like a tragic element and like kind of like a horrifying element to beauty. And I think this is the tragic element of this beatific vision, is that people can always be more than they are. And that can be really, it's been for me a difficult thing to realize. And it's not always been something that I've actually understood to be kind of like part of the thing that I'm signing up for, but like, you know, like this is my weekend, and like I'm waking up early in the morning to talk to you, and I have therapy and two other calls, and people in my family are like, like, why don't you rest? Like they're like you need to rest more. And it just doesn't occur to me to do that, because it feels like there is always so much more, um not to know propositionally, but to know in a participatory fashion. um and and I wonder how people we can afford the capacity for people to meet that, um not in a way where it's kind of this like, you know um where aspiration and virtuosity becomes like collapses into this kind of like, um competition, where it's like, I gotta like wake up at 6 and I gotta meditate, and then I gotta, like where it collapses into this like routine that you like flagellate yourself for not doing. But it's, and Vervaeke talks about like being tempted by the good. I don't remember who that comes from, but like actually wanting to do it. But then there's another thing that, like Agnes Callard talks about with aspiration, where if you're aspiring, it means that you're trying to, you're you're aspiring towards a virtue that you don't already have. And so implicit in that is, that there is a delay in the second natureness of that virtue, where there's a period of time where it does feel like work, it does feel chore-like to show up for a circling session or a dialogos session or read philosophy. Like it hasn't yet you haven't yet um it hasn't really like seeped into you yet, and you haven't really recognized the value of it. And so I think that's something that people also need to realize is like, just because something is like beautiful and apparently beautiful for someone else doesn't mean that A, it's ever going to be that way for someone else, or B, that it's going to be there immediately. And I think we can really slip into kind of like a totalitarianness of the things that we do that bring us meaning and fulfillment, and believe that other people, can feel that way too. So I know that was a lot, but kind of like bringing it just to a question is like, um, do you sense that tragic element of the kind of like the lack? I think to use kind of your terminology, and like Javier Rivera's, like the lack. Like there's always, if you're aware of your moreness, you're also aware of your lack. Like, so I'm curious
Brilliant.
how you've squared that.
Brilliant. And Javier is wonderful. So excellent. There is absolutely something tragic to beauty. There is absolutely something incomplete to a life that is toward it. What's interesting with that incompletion, though, is that if one can come to rest in it, it becomes an incomplete with the I in parentheses, where you actually find completion in that ever process. And the very fact that you have incompleteness is why you could always have intrinsic motivation, because there's always something more to do, right? And one of the problems is precisely, ironically, completeness is a problem, because then it falls into entropy, because you have a stable state. But then if you have incompleteness without any completeness at all, that just leads to fragmentation and chaos, right? So there is some sort of very odd balance between incomplete and complete. Beauty as merely pretty and joy, and then tragedy as merely suffering and catastrophe, right? And it's very interesting. The word passion, I like it when it means the joy you suffer for, where it's joy and
Mm,
suffering together. Um, Passion, if it gets overly played up to be that thing you like to do, then it can lose the tragic element that makes passion what it is. And so there has to be a certain suffering in it. And then funny enough, if you get joy without suffering, it actually can feel meaningless, and just like dopamine, right? And
right.
actually, you could argue joy without suffering is impossible, only happiness or pleasure, right? So there's something about beauty that requires a certain, calluses of the hand, a certain sort of difficulty to make possible. Now, what's very interesting is when we look back as kind of a case study of religions, like we'll just take Christianity, there's always been this tension of saying you are a sinner, but you also are loved by God and you can be a saint. You're always going to be off from God, but by his grace, you will know him. There's a psychotechnology in operation there that is addressing this problem. It is, we do, Feuerbach famously had that idea that God is a projection of, the Father. We want a Father, so we project onto God all those different things. Now, Karl Barth turns around and he says, no, it's God projecting Father onto us. It's the other way around, Feuerbach. But regardless, there is always something, there's always something in theology in operation that has something to do with various psychotechnologies. Because, it existed for hundreds of years, building traditions, trying to figure out varied tensions, on the ground experience. How do we deal with this? And it's working all these things together. So when you look at theology, you can sometimes get a glimpse of a psychotechnology intention that maybe we need to think today anew, or to bring into business or therapy or all these different things. So the idea of saying, you're a sinner, but you also can be a saint, and the least will be first and the first will be least, all these different paradoxical tensions, is one, it's always putting a question mark to social hierarchy. It's always putting a question mark to your ideas of the good. It's also putting a question mark to your ideas of the bad. Oh, you think you're being bad? Well, of course you are. You're fallen. And that's actually, Kierkegaard said that the man who knows he's in despair isn't in despair. The one who knows that life is tragic is now on the road to beauty, right? So there's this kind of idea of, I'm going to tell you the Lacanian real. I'm going to tell you the hard truth that the world has fallen, but I'm telling you that so that you may know grace and beauty, right? The trick we have now is figuring out how to do a similar move without religion. Like, how do I tell people, hey, there's a Lacanian real that's going to break through the imaginary and symbolic registers that's going to surprise you, but life is good? Oh, how do those things go together, right? There's a real tension in operation. Um, but if you do not accomplish something like the religions did in their psychotechnologies, you end up too far on the side of tragedy, which ends up in a nihilism, or you end up too far on the side of joy, which ends up in a dopamine pleasure capitalism injunction to enjoy, as Zizek talks about, right? So you have to somehow get both of them. But of course, here's the funny thing. Whatever idea you have to get both of them may only apply to you. And if you put it on everyone else, it becomes totalitarian and oppressive, right? Like, so for example, maybe a lot of creative writers will talk about writing as being this thing you suffer for. It's really confusing and difficult. None of your family thinks you're using your talents well. You're crazy. And yet, you find a joy in it that develops your subjectivity that isn't seen in any other way, right? Like the creative act can have this passion structure to it that finds the middle between hard difficulty, not simply in the craft of writing, but in the social rejection, especially if you're not published. And yet you keep at it because of the joy set before you, to use that kind of gospel language, right? But then you say, okay, well then everyone should write short stories. Well, that doesn't seem right. Now we're entering into a certain oppression there. But there is something about scaling the conditions by which the average person has an increased likelihood of finding the thing that to them has a passion structure. And the argument that is put forth in the book is the more that you make people understand lack as part of reality itself, as an apophatic opportunity for an incompletion with the I in parentheses, therefore, intrinsic motivation that can in fact be experienced as beautiful if you come to overcome the anxiety of that lack, of that incompletion, and beauty attracts and creates motivation, then that increases the probability that the average person could find in their own condition, in their own pluralistic way, the passion that creates a uniform structure between everyone who is in operation that way, but without creating a single passion that everyone has to follow. But that requires a different metaphysics. That requires a different conception of the human being. That requires a different value system. And what I would note is, although all of that, of course, sounds extremely abstract, we should note that every single social and political order is based on metaphysical and philosophical premises, right? Like the United States of America is based basically on the idea of all men are created equal. Men should be free, liberty. That actually it is not the case that if you throw man out of civilization, that they're freer, like in a Rousseauian structure, right? There are always metaphysics in operations behind social orders. And once you realize that, then the question is, what would be the metaphysics that would actually make people more attuned to living according to passion as opposed to something that was not so functional? And I should also note, as a few more notes, what ends up happening as well is on this kind of idea that you're saying where beauty has this kind of tragedy and glory to it as well. Like I always come back to the Beatrice idea where, Beatrice kind of says to Dante, hey, I really can't smile at you until you climb higher because you're unworthy of the glory. In one way, that's tragic and horrible. Dante could just kind of fall to his knees and cry. Or he can interpret that as saying, wow, if I can just ascend higher, I can see more of her smile. The very conditions that give you an adventure to have, you can only enter into that adventure if you face a certain humbling. Like, it's hard to start an adventure without a humbling. Like, why would you even go on the adventure if there wasn't something proven lacking in you, right? Like, beauty always has a certain conviction to it. It's like, that thing is magnificent, and I must not be because I'm not that. Like, you can't experience beauty without a humbling coming to it. This is why lack and beauty go together so much. Well, the very feeling of humility is then what says there's more to life than what you thought, more than heaven and earth than you thought, Horatio, as Hamlet said, right? So if we're in a world that has here's the issue. Viveki talks about a meaning crisis. There's people talking about nihilism and hopelessness and all these things. The only way to get out of that has to start with some kind of humility. Like if it doesn't start with some kind of humility, then why would it would just be another option. It would just be another arbitrary option. The only thing that's going to compel you into meaning is something that feels greater than you. If it doesn't feel greater than you, then it's just another restaurant option on a Friday night, right? But if it feels greater than you, it has to feel threatening. It has to feel humbling. It has to feel dangerous. It has to feel wonderful. Like you think of like Aslan and Narnia. Oh, he's not safe. The lion's not safe in Narnia, but he's good, right? These kind of tensions of, God's going to show up and kick over all the tables in the tax collector, but then, he's love or something, right? There are all these tensions in operations. It is hard to imagine anything compelling people into meaning that doesn't have that collection of qualities in operation all at the same time. And so there has to be, dare I say, a certain emotional complexity that you're ready for to identify the very horizon you're seeking if you're looking for meaning, if you're looking for your beauty, right? Like if you're looking for a linear emotional experience where you say, I'm searching for meaning, so I'm searching for something that makes me happy, well, then you'll never find the thing that gives you meaning, because the things that give meaning in a sustainable way that create belonging and transformation are emotionally very dynamic. There are many emotions that are going in operation. It's there's a terror to it, but a sublimity, but there's a beauty and there's a vastness, and all of that in that emotional complexity must be the characteristic that kind of pulls you forth, that makes you be drawn forth. And then the last thing I'll say, what's interesting is, funny enough, like when we talk about, because you were mentioning the issue of rest, it's important to note that in the Garden of Eden, with Sabbath, rest, pleasure, there actually is work. He has to name the animals, he has to tend to the garden, he has to take care of things. What there isn't is toil. Toil is the punishment. Toil is a work that does not create Sabbath. Like that's the other kind of funny thing. Like Sabbath is a certain work in which you find rest or find motivation to keep doing. Like it creates drive versus mere desire, to use a Lacanian distinction. Like desire has an object that once you get it, it goes away. Drive is a kind of apathetic thing. There's always a horizon in things that you're doing that you're trying to get more attuned to and to approach, right? There's this kind of ever deepening. That's part of it, right? The funny thing is, humans find rest in drive, not in a lack of work. We find rest and a certain satisfaction in precisely having something that's driving us that cannot be reduced to a mere object. We find rest in horizons, not things. Now, there is a new tension that emerges, though, like you're saying, that I think really has to be thought on the correct balance of, I could all like this very drive, then you could be reading a bunch of things, you could be learning more, you could always be doing more in a manner that might be unsustainable, right? But you see, figuring out those strategies within drive is a much better problem than being in desire, getting your object and not having desire. There is a time management problem that has to be thought within drive, but that's a good problem to have, as opposed to not caring how you use your time. Like, and a lot of times people talk about time management as a business matter, like how do we in our business optimize our corporation? What you see in drive is something different than efficiency optimization. What you see in drive is, how do I have a basket big enough to hold this abundance? How do I hold the abundance versus optimize some sort of efficiency metric, right? That's a good problem to have. And it will get into making decisions about what things you're going to do and what not. And ultimately, I guess the last thing I would say, which could be, if you find drive, I'll just say in philosophy, for example, the trick is to not let your drive get so attached to that object that you only have the horizon of intrinsic motivation doing the philosophy. You need to own that horizon, be able to carry it to gardening. You need to be able to carry it to fixing your car, into other areas of your life. Otherwise, your drive is captured by that one thing that you do, and you actually have not had it be spiritually transformative. You're still dependent on that thing. And I think, if we look at some histories of mysticism, there is this kind of notion of, can you be mystical outside the church or only in the church? Oh, you're only able to be mystical in the church? Well, there's a certain lack of development there, right? So there
Yep.
is,
Yep.
but this is what's just so funny. We're in an age of having to think these kind of spiritual practices now in order to deal. Like mysticism is moving to the forefront. But let me give it back to you.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really great. I'm reminded of a book that my therapist recommended to me. It's written by Jack Cornfield, who's the founder of Spirit Rock Meditation Center, and it's a book called oh gosh, After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. and it's this account it's this account of all of these, because he was a monk for a long time, and so it's an account of all of these, monks or nuns, or people who live in an ascetic way, who then re-enter society, and the struggles that they go through, the kind of harsh confrontation with the fact that all of their training, and all of the ways in which they were able to cultivate capacities of mindfulness does not just cure all of the problems that they have in the world. It doesn't just magically make their marital conflicts go away. It doesn't make the fact that their children, pooped their diaper and now they got to change it, go away. And some handle it a lot better than others. Some realize, um, oh, okay, everything that I've been training for is actually precisely to be able to handle this moment right here, and have this kind of, uh, you know, like broad application of you know, um, this mindful attention and this patience and all these other virtues. And then, some people, like, I think, crave the return to the monastery and on the Tibetan, cliffside, away from the world. And so, I think that book was a really interesting read. It was funny. I was reading it as I was doing laundry one day, and it just changed how I folded my laundry, that day. It was I found it a lot more enjoyable of a task. And yeah, it's interesting because for me, it like when I started, you know, doing my own therapeutic work, had a lot of trauma to work through from childhood and things like that. Um, it it really was like a pretty immediate, like, oh, like, because I think I came into it not wanting, like, I was very clear in that I wanted my life as a whole to be better, than it was. And so I don't know, like, it was just a very obvious, like, oh, this has to broadly apply to every part of my life. And, like, now, like, washing my car is like my favorite thing to do. Like, I will never go to a car wash again. And there's an interesting way in which, like, I cultivating the capacity to enjoy the quotidian actually has economic implications, because if you are, like, finding the love and the joy of gardening to a point where it doesn't become work, well, now you don't have to go to a grocery store again. You know, if you learn to love washing your car, now you don't have to go to a car wash ever again. Um, I mean, obviously, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but, like, just, that was just something that dawned on me right now. And you talk a lot about, you know the ways in which our economic capitalistic model, detaches people from involvement, like active involvement in their everyday life. And and I think that's the, like, the liberation and the freedom that I think is much more conducive to meaning and purpose, as opposed to paralysis and confusion, is this, like, hard won liberation that um comes from an appreciation of your own agency, and your own, like, I'm working in a national park right now, and one thing that I'm really obsessed with is, like, um the relational affordances that connection with nature can give us. And you mentioned Rousseau. I think one thing that Rousseau, Thoreau, all of those thinkers kind of placed in our consciousness with relation to nature is that, um this kind of passive observance of nature. Now, Thoreau was at Walden, and he was like taking samples of the pond, and he was very actively involved in creating that. But if you look at like what indigenous tribes used to, how they used to relate to nature, it was one where they recognized the human's role in creating harmony, conservation, and protection of the world. And I think, um, you know, if people can realize the beauty in making their own food, washing their own car, doing those things where it doesn't feel like an exhausting, backbreaking affair, but it's actually something they look forward to. Um, that can really create a lot of economic freedom. And I think you living on a farm, I'm are I'm sure you realize that. And so I'd be curious to know if that lands for you personally, and more broadly.
Absolutely. Excellent. On the idea of after the ecstasy, the laundry, that's tremendous. And basically, a way to put the argument is we are in an age where we went through a period of doing the laundry without the ecstasy. Then we went through an age of emphasizing the ecstasy independent of the laundry. And now we have to return to the laundry with the ecstasy. We talk about David Hume and the return to common life. Returning to the laundry and keeping the ecstasy is a remarkably difficult undertaking. But there is something about the kind of subjectivity that can do that, that then changes how they behave in an economy, in a politics, faced with the other, in pluralism, that moves one away from geopolitical tensions that are unsustainable, a capitalism that ultimately becomes so dependent on stimulating demand that it creates wealth inequality. It ultimately multipolar traps, as Daniel Smackenberg talks about, et cetera, so forth. Because your economy is ultimately a reflection of human motivation, what motivates people. Most of human, a lot of economics starts from the motivation of necessity. I need water. Wouldn't it be nice if I had water available to me? Okay, a store provides water. There we go. But then it can start to move to nicety, candy. You don't necessarily need candy, but it'd be nice to have candy because I like it. So a store provides candy and you go from there. But what would it look like to have stores that provide candy that you nevertheless say, no, I don't want the candy, I'll just stick with the water? That is not the same as the world that didn't have candy available to it. The world where candy is available, but you choose not to eat the candy, is one that has a different kind of subjectivity in it than the one where candy just wasn't available at all. That there is a development in the negation, as Hegel would say. There is a difference between the kind of subjectivity that is able to deny or turn down an external stimulation than one that just simply is not presented one at all. And that's very so it's most people say never go to the ecstasy. They just stay in the laundry. They don't have an idea of it. But then a lot of people, when they taste the ecstasy, they're like, I don't want to leave it. I want to stay, as David Hume said, in the ivory tower. But the problem is that if you stay in the ivory tower, if you're the intellectual that goes off to college, you begin to think that you're better than all those people back home, that you're smarter, you should run the world, and you get the philosophical dictator and tyrant from Mr. Hume. Likewise, if you get the religious people that go and have the mystical experience, it's like, they don't ever think how to run a church, how to run a ministry, how to run these different things. And then of course the problem is the church gets separated from those who have the mystical origin that they could kind of tie together, and as a result, both end up in pathologies. The one with the ecstasy becomes pathological because they simply are in the ecstasy, almost like a Huxley novel with the soma or something like that. And then you have the religion that with bad ideas tends to go toward totalitarianism, dogma, very, restricting people that have the wrong beliefs, et cetera, so forth, right? So you have to have both, but doing both is very, very hard. It ties very much into capitalism because theoretically, if you had a world where people were able to find that joy in washing their car, consumer behavior would change. The kind of things that people demanded would be very different. And here's the thing. When we talk in the book, Belonging Again Too, on the difference between creating demand and stimulating demand, when you decide I get to the place where I am able to wash my car in a manner that has some sort of uplifting quality, you are creating a demand. You are creating, nowhere in the world gives you that demand to wash your car in that certain way. You have created that possibility of a demand on yourself by your own development, right? And you don't feel as you're washing your car as if you're toiling. You feel like you're working, to go back to that distinction from Eden, right? You're not in a toil place, but in order to experience washing your car as work versus toil, there had to be a certain what? Spiritual development, character, process, practices that you go through to get to that place, right?
Intrinsic motivation.
Yes, exactly.
Hmm.
And that has to be developed. If you had people who were capable to be motivated that way, then there's a decentralization that occurs. It's much more unlikely for you to be susceptible to some strongman that comes on and offers you the world, because you're like, well, what can you offer me? I have my car and I can clean it, right? You're less susceptible to fall into nihilism and hopelessness because you say, well, I lost my car. There's a lot of hope in that. There's a lot of joy in that experience, right? That very act creates a certain metaphysical decentralization where people are actually defended from political forces of manipulation or feelings of hopelessness or so on and so forth. And the market is less able to capture people or to manipulate them precisely because they have a motivational barrier from the algorithm, from the Deleuzian capture, from all of these market forces that are trying to get you to spend. Well, that can work against techno-feudalism, as Vars talks about, monopoly power. It can work against game A, as it can work against all of these competitive forces, right? And the key to all of this, though, is we are talking about a sublation of capitalism within capitalism. Because what you're doing, and this goes back to what we were saying at the beginning, if you are in capitalism and you're able to be intrinsically motivated, you create a kind of contradiction between yourself and the macro system. Because what the macro system is implying upon you, like is trying to motivate you according to, is not the motivation that you have. So there's a certain contradiction, there's a certain tension there that you are holding. Well, what did we say at the beginning? We were saying that contradiction and paradox is actually what develops, right? Is what creates sublation, is what takes a seed and it grows it, right? You have a lot of people that want to rebel and overthrow capitalism. The 20th century can be a long story of that. But that's not creating the Hegelian contradiction that will lead to a sublation. That's why it ultimately doesn't work, because you haven't addressed the human subjectivity that is acting out of a resentment or a nihilism or a certain hopelessness. And as a result, even if you overthrow capitalism, you just recreate the same motivational conditions that gave it to you in the first place, and you get all sorts of pathologies. Also, capitalism is the only system that has dealt with the coordination of limited resources, like Friedrich Hayek talks about. He talks about the knowledge problem, you have the coordination problem. Like capitalism is the very fact that you can get water, or you can get in your car, or you have a car to clean. That's pretty miraculous in human history. And capitalism is the only system that has figured out how to successfully coordinate that. Now, you have models that are going to try central planning with AI, but that may not be the world we want to live in, where AI is coordinating all the resources versus the pricing mechanism. And to put that very quickly, the pricing mechanism allows a uncentralized coordination of where resources should go in a manner that people could afford. So if you're in New York and water is $8 a bottle, then there's a lot of incentive to send bottled waters up to New York to get that huge profit, but that brings the prices down. Whereas in Florida, if bottled water is 50 cents, there's not much incentive to send water down there because there's not much profit. So you get this coordination relative to the distribution of resources with the profits. Now, it's much more complicated than that, but a lot of people don't realize that pricing and prices are a complex calculate. It's like a giant computer of the coordination of where resources and things go. And if you don't have that, you get all sorts of economic problems. But this is the problem then, because that means the system of very successfully coordinating resources is also tied to things that give you a financial system that may be destroying the middle class or causing wealth inequality, right? So, or it's manipulating people with dopamine. So how do you deal with that? Well, you have to give rise to a contradiction within capitalism, which would be on the ground of the subjective motivation that creates a tension that, oh my gosh, these people aren't buying what they want. They can't be manipulated like they were because they're able to find a certain ecstasy in washing the car. Well, then capitalism has to shift, because it's not making profit. It's not able to generate a return in the same way that it did before. So then it may have to start investing in actually the infrastructure that enables people to be intrinsically motivated. It may have to start investing in community and experiences and actually philosophy and circling and different things, because that's what people want, because they want to actually have that ability of experiencing in a horizon of life. So by creating, so then I'll give it back to you, we have to think about changing the political economy by creating within it an internal contradiction that causes the tension that leads to a sublation. Otherwise, you're going to get unintentional consequences. The only way to do that is to somehow transform the motivation of people, how people are motivated and what motivates them. And basically, the conditions that we argue is a movement, to put it very generally, from external motivation to intrinsic motivation. If you make that shift, you've created the conditions of a possible sublation in the political economy and all of these different things. And when you get a sublation, that's when you get something new that brings with it the good of the old. Like you'll bring with it the benefits of capitalism, but not the pathologies. That's kind of the logic of a sublation, right? Now you're going to get new problems, new issues you have to work through, but you'll also be advancing in a manner that is not throwing out something without an idea of what to replace it with, which is when you get all the pathologies and different things of history. So really focusing in on that question of how to have ecstasy while doing the laundry becomes really central to create the sublation that has these more macro consequences.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it points to the necessity of um, working within the system to change it instead of just exiting the system
Mm-hmm.
altogether.
Yeah.
And I think people who, are screaming death to capitalism, um, capitalism is it's almost too big to fail. Like so the the I mean the projects that have tried to overthrow it have failed because either they unknowingly just reproduce capitalism um in just a different way with like maybe a different political structure, but it's still a market driven economy, or capitalism you know revives itself in some way. And so I think there's a real danger in throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and and failing to realize like what capitalism provides people um, when it's best engineered is an attempt to um, again, kind of paradoxically, like leave it to a certain extent. If you just take the model of like the entrepreneur or the small business owner, it's like in a way they're leaving um, the consumerist, like I'm just going to be a consumer instead of a producer, capitalism, and they are making a new, they are implementing a novel need instead of just a producer in the kind of reductive capitalist sense. It's like you're just a producer of the machine. You're just a cog in the machine, as opposed to someone who can still work within the frameworks of market incentives, but they have left that dichotomy. Um, and so I think that's the real skill that needs to be cultivated. And that's what I see on this little corner of the internet. It's like it's it's independent people who are writing, they're speaking, they're talking to people, they're creating content. Um, but it's not within the typical confines and the typical ideas and perspectives of what your YouTube algorithm is spitting out at you. But then the concern is like, okay, if you're gonna create something like this little corner of the internet, and you talked about this, it's like, how does that scale? Um, because there's a lot of people who are really intelligent, fantastic people who, you know, have uh, have left the matrix, but no one knows about them. Like no one knows who they are. And are those people really better off than they were, before? Maybe there's like an internal satisfaction that they have, and maybe they have, you know, a partner and friends who they're able to like talk about these things with. But like, um, there's a lack of a feeling of belonging and value within this ecosystem. And so how, how to create the mechanisms for scaling without it then just being reduced into, um, okay, well now I'm just going to put things out to get clicks and just play into the way that YouTube is run, and then that takes all of why I wanted to do it in the first place away. Um, or the concern of people who become infatuated with their own image and their own success, who leave the producer consumer capitalistic model, get some notoriety and attention, and then um, kind of just become narcissistic. Um, you know, yeah. So there's a lot of real tensions and difficulties, and I think there are communities that have already figured out, or are at least are aware of all of these issues. I think circling is one where, I was talking to someone the other day, like I think the reason why it works so well, is that the people in leadership, so Guy, everybody else, they are participating. They are active participants in the practice.
Mhm.
Whereas a lot of things that become cultish environments, the leader is somehow positioned like above the own thing that they created. Um,
Yeah.
and so they are not tapping in that strike of humility that you were talking about that affords beauty. They are not confronting their own humility, and their own lack, because they're not participating in the thing. And so they can very easily become holier than thou as a result. And so I think that's a crucial element of scaling community, is that whoever is doing the scaling has um has to be participating in the thing that they're trying to create.
Brilliant. I completely agree. So a few things. There's always the danger of forming a community that leads to a cult. And some of the advantages of this little corner of the internet, or the liminal web, or whatever phrase we use, is precisely the transparency of it on video, precisely the fact that it's a dialogue based, therefore it's multiple people speaking. All of these things actually can help work against the cult tendency. And also, too, you can start to tell if a video or a channel is going in the direction of clicks, right? There's a way, and I think actually the skill of identifying that will be increasingly a skill that you gain, like tasting fine wine. You can tell the difference between, I'll talk about the difference between cultivating, the attentionalism and cultivating awareness in a Simone Weil way, or she talks about attention actually, but it's confusing. But awareness, Ivan Illich, McGilchrist, Illich, like awareness, like is basically that ability to see the car as a source of intrinsic motivation, or to meet the horizon, the apathetic and the beautiful, right? That would be what they're getting at with awareness. And the attentionalist economy can actually be a unique infrastructure for the cultivation of awareness, precisely because it helps with a social coordination problem that we've never been able to solve, except by making universities where all people interested in, say, philosophy would gather. Therefore, they could have a network effect. Well, that meant you had to have the connections, the money, get in, and it became an industry. Now, thanks to Zoom, YouTube, and stuff like this, we're actually able to more efficiently coordinate people that want to read Hegel just to read Hegel, people that want to talk about beauty to do beauty, people that want to do circling to get to their emotional life and figuring out. People can now more efficiently find one another and engage in that practice, which for basically all of history until about, I would say 2018, it's very new, this infrastructure. Like, sure, there was internet, sure, there was video call, but not enough people had high-speed internet. Zoom technology was certainly not as advanced. You didn't have the record function. Like, this infrastructure that we are using is relatively new, is incredibly new. And and in the same way that the pricing mechanism allows a efficient distribution of resources, this technology allows a certain coordination of social capital that is very advanced compared to what we had for most of history. And you see, here's the funny thing, without justifying it entirely, but if you take my word for it, if you go back through history and see that really what generated a lot of wealth, a lot of new ideas, and basically the worlds that we live in, the paradigms, were groups of people hanging out in a bar, Bloomsbury group, Federalist paper, like these groups of people gathering and like doing this kind of thing. If that is what makes the world, like makes its value horizon, then a more efficient system of doing that will allow possibilities of value development that were before not possible, like different value forms versus just the commodity value form, as Marx talks about. Like, we now, like Zach Stein and Gaffney talk about opening the eye of value. Well, opening the eye of value requires an infrastructure to make you realize there's an eye of value to open, and by which to cultivate the skills of so opening that eye of value and being able to value things differently. Well, you needed an infrastructure to do that. And anywhere that was located in human history, you were basically lucky. Even if you went to a college, they could have been taken over by market forces, and so you couldn't rely on that. Maybe church, but then churches could get sucked into different ideas. It's been very, very difficult to find those apathetic spaces, if you will, those spaces of the mystery, those spaces in which people are trying to participate in something bigger than themselves. It's been very, very difficult. We now have a kind of apathetic coordination system, if you will, to use that apathetic term. It's, we have a coordination system for that. And if, in fact, this kind of thing has always been what has actually generated the wealth, that's why we talked about Dietrich McCloskey on a change in how people speak. It creates a network effect. You can look at Randall Collins on network effects, freeing of speech, Jonathan Rauch, paradigm shifts, and Kuhn, the whole counter-enlightenment. I could keep going. If that's actually the source of what actually embetters people, well, then a more efficient system of that coordination, there's no telling what sort of embetterment could happen. But it is only going to survive with what James Hunter calls a faithful presence, like you were talking about. So there's a few things. Before I forget, it is exactly the case that you can avoid the cult leader if the cult participates in the process. I think what you're getting at there is the need to rethink spaces. I was speaking with Joel Carini at the Natural Theologian with King Laugh about how the idea of a pastor in front talking to a congregation, there's a strong argument to be made that Jesus would not support that. He would not support the 40-minute sermon. He would support more of a discussion circle. The college structure, that's a very problematic thing. You go to college and they say, we're going to teach the Socratic dialogue, and proceed to never teach the Socratic dialogue because the teacher doesn't, it never is. Yeah. Socrates is participating in it. Also, too, it is very difficult to avoid a cult if you don't have an emergent apathetic thing that comes out of relations, because then it's the guru who has the truth and they're going to give it to you, right? But if the beauty comes out of something that must be circled, if you will, then you can have a guide. You can have someone who's an expert in creating the conditions of that thing emerging, but they don't equal the source of that thing. That's the key difference. They can, like Hyroot would talk about the need for guides. And you see, guides don't really become cults because you have to do the walking. The guide simply is like, hey, I know the way, but your way is not my way. And all I can do is help create a space, right? I don't hold the truth. The truth is the space. The truth is beyond us. It's apathetic, but we can guide it, right? So you have to have something like that to avoid the cult, in my opinion. And that's also where an emphasis on an apathetic God or an apathetic lack, like beauty being tied to lack, is really, really important, because that automatically means no one can have a monopoly on it. There's always something in excess to the people there. So that's very, very important. The other things I was going to say on like the spread of the liminal web and the kind of cultivation of these different things, is that if you go through history and you definitely see, like, it's really hard for us to imagine, because we're so drunk on utilitarianism and pragmatism, but Michelle Bowens really emphasizes this, like the idea that non-market spaces, like the common space, as Michelle Bowens, the commons, the bar where Adam Smith and Hume are hanging out, the Bloomsbury Group, the market, the church. It is really difficult for us to believe that those are the places where values are created and people just choose their kind of ethic and how they're going to operate in the world. And then they determine pragmatism, because we're so trained to decide what we're going to do with our life based on what's going to get us a job, right? But that's what you see in history. And really, because for the last, I don't know, after World War II, basically, like for about 70 or so years, you've had a world that has attempted to collapse the commons in the market and have people's values come from the market and the organizing principles of their lives. That worked for a time. It wasn't all bad. It was something, it required a historic moment. Like the Francis Fukuyama neoliberalism required that attempt to try it and to see what's good about it, what's not good about it. And now you're at the saturation point where you have to make the choice. You know, you're at that historical moment. And what we have to do is regain a common space, regain a space where values can be created independent of the market that you then bring into the market that then changes what the market organizes. You know, another way to put this is the market, capitalism is not necessarily your enemy. All capitalism does is give you what you want. So if you want to destroy the world, it will happily destroy the world. If you want to destroy the world and don't know you're accidentally wanting to destroy the world because your consumer habits are unsustainable, the problem is that capitalism will eventually make you see, oh my gosh, what we're doing is unsustainable. And then we blame capitalism for that, when really it's the values that we had that led us to that place, or the spiritual deficiencies, or the unsustainable habits, or the lack of seeing where this path was leading us, right? But if you could bring different values to the market, well, the market, yeah, it may try to create incentives against that because it's been trained into doing so for 70 years, but it will not ban you. It will not kick you out because you like to wash your car in the way that you were describing, right? You're not going to be put in jail because you wash the car that way. We're not going to be put in jail because we're studying philosophy, right? All the market can do to stop this is basically make you feel like you're wasting your time, or make you feel like you're a fool, or you're not getting paid for it, or stuff like that. But you see, this is the point. The very fact that the liminal web has that fragility to it is a necessary component for it to be an alternative to the values of capitalism. Because creating that fragility is the only way that capitalism could try to stop the new value system from coming in, which the people who run capitalism have incentive to do, right? You got to make a distinction between the winners of capitalism now and capitalism as a system. Sure, the winners don't want an alternative value system because they've got a monopoly on the commodity form and they want people to keep consuming as such, right? For the profits, et cetera, so forth. But that fragility is precisely evidence that you could be offering an alternative value system, and thus that there's hope in it, and yet it's easy to interpret that fragility as evidence that you're doing something wrong. Like it's fragile and it doesn't seem sustainable and it seems impossible to scale. Well, that must be evidence that it's wrong. Well, actually, no, that's evidence that it's an alternative source of values. The question is maintaining what James Hunter said is the faithful presence. How do you maintain a faithful presence to the work so that the infrastructure can develop, so that the resources could be there where more and more people can gradually encounter it? Because cultural change, and then I'll give it back to you, cultural changes tend to be exponential curves. Like, Alex Ebert will talk about the Sasquatch man, and an exponential curve is where a linear curve is 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, gets you what an exponential curve is. 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8, 8 times, and then boom, it just starts, the curve does this, right? That's how it tends to work with cultural things. But you have to get through that long process of gradual development before you start having people say, oh, that's what we want. And then actually, the likelihood that it spreads goes up the more and more the external world enters into pathologies, because then people come to look for an alternative, right? They're eager for an alternative. Precisely, nihilism, the meaning crisis, is what makes people open to alternative spaces like circling or learning for learning's sake or different things. That's when you use it kind of in a tight, like Eastern martial arts way. You use the very meaning crisis against itself. That very meaning crisis creates a willingness of people to consider new sources of values, which, if you can maintain the faithful presence and keep doing the work and figure out how to be sustainable enough to keep it going and then do it long term, then you create a kind of basket to catch people as they are interested in it. And as they then practice and feel the difference, they tell other people about it, then they tell other people about it, and you get a different mode of valuation, a different mode of exchange, as someone like a Koratani would put it. But you have to maintain a faithful presence to that work. You have to continue creating those spaces. But let me pause and give it back to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that really resonates. And it's interesting too, like to think about, because most of the people who find their way to, this little corner, are people who have basically been compelled into it, where, and I think that really does go to the kind of dragged interpretation, where it's not quite a dragged interpretation, because um a lot of those a lot of people find themselves intrinsically attracted and move by their own volition over here, but it came from a real crisis of meaning, you know a loneliness, an isolation, a painful lack of meaning in their life. Um, and so I wonder, does that have to be how people find their way here, or can we um, have 5-year-olds do circling in a way that's appropriate for 5-year-olds, and have that be like, avoid people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s,
Mm-hmm.
almost like, you know, um, destroying themselves and destroying their lives and the people around them before they become like compelled into this. Like, can this be something that, school children understand the value of? And I remember John Vervaeke had a while back, he had this guy on who's he's a teacher at, it's a religious high school, I think, and he's quite young himself. And he talks about how, like, you know, I think he helps. I think he's a choir teacher or something like that. And like, when the students come in, their freshman year, they don't see the beauty of it. They want to listen to pop music and the things that the other students are listening to. But by their senior year, like, they're voluntarily going to the symphony and listening to
Yeah.
classical music and like gospel music, and like wanting no part in, you know, pop music. And so, I mean, like, if that can be scaled, right? Like, think about
Yeah.
how much more beautiful the world will be. Um,
Yeah.
because, if you have your whole life attracted by, those things, as opposed to, you know, half of your life, right? Even me, I mean, I'm in my 20s, but it's like, if I, you know, if I could have been seeing the world this way like 10 years ago, um, who knows how different my life would have been.
Outstanding. Again, I always just find it very interesting that we're in an age where what were traditionally questions of religion and mysticism are moving into the foreground, because the big question is, can you come to God unless you've gone through devastation? You had your idol smash, it tends to be devastation that leads people to God, or the alternative is beauty. People have a mystical vision. They say, well, there must be something beyond this world, right? So there's always been this kind of interesting question of, devastation and beauty as almost seeming to be necessary prerequisitions, one or the other, or maybe both in some order, to bring people to being open to a different way of life. Because the thing is, when we talk about people being open to God, it's not like people directly experience God or necessarily have like, it's a mode of being they take on that changes their values, their motivations, and how they spend their time. Like if you were just looking between two people and one of them moved into a belief of God, but you didn't know they moved into a belief of God, simply as like a Martian, you would simply notice a different use of time, a different use of money, a different use of interactions, right? That something must have occurred because the way they practically live shifts. And sometimes I think we overly emphasize the change of metaphysical beliefs and don't look enough at, wow, they're an entirely different consumer. Wow, they have a different way of talking. They have a different way they spend their time. That is a result of this shift that seems to be genesised by either beauty or devastation often. Now, of course, the problem is a lot of people's devastation that could make them manipulatable to a cult, right? Like that's the problem. Like people go through hardship and then the religions kind of come in and it's parasitical. That doesn't seem good. But it is that devastation that seems to make people open to things. And you could say one of the great problems is now in a world where we're not able to think how to scale conditions of beauty, then we leave people to be open to an alternative by devastation. Well, the alternative they're open to may not be the little corner of the internet. It may be fascism or popularism or a cult, right? So we really need to offer more and more opportunities of the beauty as what attracts people into an alternative, because the devastation, especially now, is too easily used by political groups or corporations to their benefits, right? Whereas maybe in the past 200 years ago, if someone had a devastation, that may actually turn them in a more spiritual direction. Now it may just lead people more in a political or market direction. So we may have exhausted that methodology to move people in this. But that leaves us with beauty, and beauty is mysterious. So what the heck do we do? It's easier to think of people changing their life because of a devastation than it is to think of people changing their life because of an experience of beauty. But that's the challenge because we've got to. So a few things. I think there is very good reason, because these are kind of more the practical. I think there is very good reasons to think that a child actually could, if they were presented with the space in which to do it, would be more eager to engage in philosophical discussion or education that's based on conversation or experience than we realize. One of the big things we say, so there's a few things. One, the classroom has to move from a test model to an oral model, like oral education. It has to be based on actually creating a space where children, whatever it is, the thing that they happen to enjoy doing, they're able to be guided to do. I know Zach Stein has talked about potentially using AI to bring you more of that kind of focused educational system that people can have. You must remove tests. You must remove grades as we do it, because what that does is make learning about the gamification for the grade as opposed to learning to be about going deeper into the mystery. Our big critique of education, because I think the school is a big factor here, is the background values the classroom teaches you. Like this is where Neil Postman, you know how Neil Postman took the Marshall McLuhan idea of the medium is the message, right? You hear that, the medium is the message. And Neil Postman says, well, let's apply that to the classroom. What is the message that the medium of the classroom teaches people? Well, we said it earlier. It teaches you that the point of learning is to be good at trivia, to be able to answer random questions, to be able to make an authority happy. You're able to say whatever the boss wants to hear. You're able to say it faster than other people. It also teaches you that community should be relative to similar ages because you're around people of a similar age. And that learning, there are certain levels that you can handle of learning at certain ages. Like you can't read Aristotle in the 4th grade. You have to go to college. There are certain assumptions. Now, they didn't think that way at all, but we think that way, right? When you are indirectly teaching kids that's going to go a long way to getting in the way of kids actually being able to associate something like circling with what education is about, or oration, or conversation, or voicecraft, as Tim Adlin, to use that phrase from that wonderful organization. Like the classroom is absolutely hindering in its form. Like the form is more important than the information here. We really overly emphasize the information that kids receive versus the formulation that they are incubated according to, which is architected by the classroom, like the classroom and the design, right? We need to have more design thinking versus information thinking. Also, colleges basically have a monopoly on credentials. That must go away. Like wherever you have a monopoly, you tend to have inefficiency. So you basically have to go to college to get a good paying job, right? Well, right there, then everything becomes about going to college, and education is about getting a good job. Well, under that structure, why would you ever think to use education to engage in circling or like learning for having a certain way of engaging? That's a waste of time, right? College, basically the certification needs to be replaced by the portfolio, something like where you see people's education or the oral exam. In the 70s, there was a Supreme Court ruling that made it difficult to do employment testing because people could use test. Like it used to be a lot easier, legally easier, to go to a job and they would test you to see if you had the certification, and if you did, you could get the job, right? But then people were using that for racism, xenophobia, so they banned it. But the problem is they basically just outsourced employment testing to colleges, and you have the same problem of minorities not being able to get into college. So you've not really dealt with the problem, you've just moved it. And now employment testing tends to be, oh, you have the certification, so they can claim that they're testing to confirm the certification from the university if you have some of these like Silicon Valley companies that do it, but it's not a direct employment test. I would like to open up that competition, because if you have a 42-year-old single mom who has learned from YouTube how to code, she should be able to get that job if she's better than the kid out of Harvard at 22 or whatever, right? Like you need much more competition and certification. As you do this, here's the key. As you remove the regime of certification, which I've been like really critiqued, as you transform the formulation of the classroom, and there's a few more things, but let's just take, and you replace the resume with the portfolio, that would be a very important. Like as a photographer, I worked as a photographer for 10 years, and if I just show you my resume and well, where's your portfolio? We'd like to see. No, I don't have a portfolio. I just have my resume. They're not going to hire you. They expect to see your work, right? Like we have a resume culture, not a portfolio culture, because really we just want to confirm your certification, not your ability. And actually, once you get on, we tend to job train you out of that anyway, right? So it's just completely inefficient. And furthermore, all of it indirectly says that the point of the classroom and school and learning and reading is not to be able to participate in a circling that makes you toward the apathetic, but in order to participate in capitalism, which then ironically means capitalism is less able to create demand, and so it becomes a great stagnation. That's the great joke. This system in the name of capitalism actually makes capitalism less likely to create wealth, because it tends to create wealth when you have more individuals who are intrinsically motivated, if we go back to like a Dietrich Bukowski and different things. So those are definitely, there's more to be said, but those are some examples of structural things. And the key is we need to think about structure. We need to think about this problem of scale, not as information, but formulation. Dr. James K. Smith talks about that. He has a lovely book where he says, you are what you love. And what he talks about is when you go to the mall is a cultural liturgy that works on your love to make you love the gap. Then you get in loves create habits, which then create characters. So capitalism is always creating cultural liturgies that makes you want things, which then develops habits of you wanting those things and habits to get those wants, and then formulate your characters. So basically, you have to create alternative cultural liturgies that transform what people want to do. Once they're introduced to circling or stuff like we do on the liminal web, there can be a want to do that, there can be a love to do that. Then people change their habits. They change, therefore, their consumer habits, their daily habits, and then that changes their character. And once you start doing that, then you're looking at a modeling of scale that is not simply one of giving people the right information, or you're not even asking to change people's minds. That's the other issue. Like if you have a scaling process where you're like, we got to make sure people change their minds and have the right beliefs, that's not what we're saying. People can bring whatever beliefs, whatever pluralism they want. It's in a form where that diversity can interact in a different way and thus change how people formulate their habits and character, which then make them more capable of generating this intrinsic motivation that is able to create demand, not simply stimulate demand, and create all sorts of economic pathologies. So it's a matter of architect. It's a matter of formulation, not information. And I think looking at the classroom as a case study begins kind of opening up what that would look like.
Fantastic, fantastic. Um, I do have to get going pretty soon,
I
so
understand. I understand. I
I'm
should
gonna
as
be
well.
yeah, I'm gonna attempt to wind it down. But yeah, that was all really wonderful. So many different threads I want to pull on, and I think I only have the constraints as we talk about the time constraints to maybe yank on one. But I was just thinking about like my own experience in therapy, and
Mm.
what I've continuously been like astounded by is my therapist has never ever told me to do something. Never. Never has there been like, I think or even like a I think this would be like there's been nothing. There's been nothing of that sort. And I don't know if it was just my particular like just nerdiness around wanting to be there. Whereas I'd imagine he has a lot of other clients where it's you know, someone else is asking them to be there or they don't enjoy it as much, and there kind of has to be more of like a okay, here's our plan. But he's you know he doesn't do the traditional CBT where it's very behaviorally focused. It's much more of like, let's explore the narratives that you hold. Where have they come from? Where have you received them from? And if you really drop down into yourself, are those what you really believe? And then he doesn't do the move where he's like, okay, well, this is what you should believe. Like this is maladaptive and then this is adaptive. Let's just cut that out and then paste this one in. And that's gonna afford, positive movement. It's like, let's explore for you um what seems true, or at least what seems like an orientation that you would want to move in to explore whether this is true. Because there's been a lot of things that I have kind of unlearned, and then what I've then moved towards hasn't necessarily been outrightly wrong, but it needed refining. But what he was doing is he was building my capacity to both challenge givens and the resiliency to um, to hold the anxiety of being wrong or not having all of the answers. Um, and and I think that's really what you're kind of alluding to is like the ability for the menti divergence that
Yep,
you talk
yep.
about, like building that capacity, and that's really something that I have experienced. And it gets really difficult when you have experienced a life of trauma, where there have been authoritative family figures, maybe narcissistic ones. Um, in my case, separating yourself from authority is so difficult. Um, I mean, it feels like a betrayal. You feel guilty for doing it. Um, and then what's on the other side? You've spent your whole life deferring to this authority figure. If you then pivot, you've lost your like for me, it's like I felt like I lost my whole identity. Like I felt like a vacuous, like I had no self-governing. I really didn't have an internal monologue that was mine. My internal monologue was someone else's. And so training that capacity, you know, um, I don't think it can be done alone. I think people who do it alone suffer tremendously. Um, and so it's like scaling the opportunities for people to have experiences with what you talk about, guides, right? Because not everyone's going to have the financial means to access therapy. Um, Not everyone's going to be lucky where the first therapist that they encounter when they're 20 changes their life in a positive way. I have a lot of friends for which they are still searching for that person, and they've gone through a handful of therapists. So it's like I think I feel as though my personal calling is is to spread that within the field of psychotherapy, that way of relating to people. But like there. there needs to be more teachers that are like that, that are, um, like Robin Williams from Dead Poet Society, where the grade that those kids got was not, he did not give a shit about that at all. It was like, how can reading and talking too about poetry, how can that afford transcendence? And and I think as that continues to be spread, more and more people will, even if they don't voluntarily seek it out, even if they haven't made that decision, they are they are more and more likely to be confronted by it. You know,
Yep.
your AP Lit class is going to more likely be a potentially transformative experience than just a slog through reading Huck Finn. Like it's
Yep.
going to be like reading it in a different way. And so yeah, I'll pass it back to you, and then probably we'll probably close off.
Beautiful. Everything you said, I completely agree with. What That's Socrates. Like if we actually talk about the Socratic method, what you see in Socrates is a teacher that brings together education and therapy. And one of the key dimensions of philosophy, it allows you to go through therapy without knowing you're going through therapy. It is a therapeutic process without being aware it's a therapeutic process. Like when you ask, if you say everyone should go to therapy, a lot of people will be like, why? I have nothing wrong. The problem is often you don't go to therapy until something's wrong, but then it might be too late to prevent it, or it's deeper or unnecessary, right? Basically, global pluralism, because you said it very well. When you lose your givens, there's a kind of abyssalness. Like you lose your voice, you don't know who you are. That's what Philip Reeve said. Like if you have no givens, if it's all release, there's a certain abyssalness that can set in that's very problematic. And then if everyone creates their own internal voice, you move from the neurotic to the psychosis, and that's not going to work. You need a certain necessary level of good neurotic authority to socialize you, but then it could also manipulate you too. So right now we're trapped between the overly neurotic and the overly psychosis, right? So you need, following the Lacanian kind of language, right? So you need to somehow bring those together. Cadell has talked about the sithone, right? Finding that kind of home in this ability to have your own voice, but also a voice that sings with a choir. You mentioned a choir. A choir is a great metaphor for this because a choir is different voices, different people, but making a harmony. So we'll talk about a harmony in belonging again. How do you get a harmony between the neurotic and the psychosis, the many and the one problem, right? And basically today we have to solve the many and the one problem, whereas for most of history we could just ignore it. Basically, philosophy is critical for this because the only way to deal with this is some sort of, you put it very well, gaining of capacity. You talked about a gaining of capacity. Well, that gaining of capacity comes basically through therapy. But then if people don't go to therapy until they need therapy, we may already have World War III. We may already have a political crisis. It's too late, right? So how do you introduce people to the therapeutic method without them knowing it's the therapeutic method? Well, that's basically the philosophical method. That is the oral tradition. That is the discussion. Like when you read the Socratic dialogues in Plato, to bring this to a close, there is actually a certain therapy. Well, what do you mean by justice? Why do you think that way? Like it's asking why do you think that way? And so you have to do, so what are you doing? You're creating your own internal voice in community. That's the key. You're creating your own internal voice as you engage philosophy without even knowing you're doing so. And it's not psychosis because it has to be tested and in relation with the person that you're doing the dialogos with. And that becomes the capacity to sing in that choir, to create harmony that then has a certain, it doesn't fly off into the psychosis that becomes chaotic. It actually is an individualism for the point of the harmony of the dialogos and philosophy. So basically, and the key also with philosophy as I'm describing it is we're not saying everyone needs to learn the history of philosophy. That's really the problem. Most people, when they hear the word philosophy, they think you're saying everyone needs to read, Plato, then Aristotle, then Plotinus, and like no, 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 no. When we talk about philosophy, we're talking about a mode of interacting with people. We're talking about a way of discussion, a way of carrying yourself, a love of wisdom, a love of something beyond the two people there that is beyond them and their ability to navigate. We really need to think philosophy, not the history of philosophy, but the mode of dialogue, the mode of discussion, the mode of thinking, which is therapy, which is a form of therapy without knowing it's therapy. And under global pluralism, basically everyone requires that. It is also what creates the conditions of intrinsic motivation, changes consumer habits, and makes it more sustainable to deal with pluralism. And basically, that is what needs to be scaled in the classroom by changing the classroom structure. And that's what we need to continue to have a faithful presence to. So I've appreciated this chance to speak with you, Michael. It's been a delight.
Fantastic. It's been an absolute honor. I feel like a mark of any good discussion is knowing that eight more can be had. Um, but
Absolutely.
this has been fantastic. It really has been a great treat for me to to just be faithfully present to to you and all the ideas we've shared, and I'm looking forward to. I think there's another week of the class, or
Yes.
one more.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, looking
One
forward to the
more. Here
last
we
one.
are.
Uno más.
Yes, sir. Thank you,
But
Michael. It's been a
yes,
treat.
it really has. Thank you so much, Daniel. I will see you next week.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, sir.
Bye.
All the best. Thank you, Michael. All the
Thank
best
you.
to you.